Imagine if it were your daughter, a bright, playful 9-year-old. She leaves home on a quick errand and never comes back. Picture the worry, the panic. As hours stretch into days, you search every street, every corner, hoping to see her running back home. And then, 2 weeks later, she's found. Her small, lifeless body lies hidden in the woods. Her innocence stolen in the most horrific way. But the one who did this, the person who tore your family apart, left nothing behind. No clues, no fingerprints, just silence. For 50 years, that silence was all Debbie Lynn Randall's family had. 50 years with no answers, no justice, only questions, haunting them day after day. Who did this? And why? That was Debbie's story, and it was my story too. I was a young detective back then. I promised her family I'd find the person who did this. I followed every lead, searched every path, but the trail went cold. Debbie's case became a mystery that no one could solve. And then 50 years later, technology finally broke that silence. A single match, a name hidden all these years, and with that, we finally uncovered the truth. Today, I'm asking you to join me as we go back to that cold February night in 1972, to see each twist, each dead end, and to follow the trail that finally led to justice. This is the story of Debbie Lynn Randall and the fight for answers that lasted a lifetime. It was a typical Sunday evening in Marietta, Georgia. Debbie Lynn Randall, a lively 9-year-old, asked her mother if she could go out to play with her friends. Her mother, Juanita, agreed, but asked her to pick up some washing powder from the laundromat on her way back. A quick, simple errand just a block away. Debbie left, promising to be home soon. But as night settled over Marietta, she didn't come back. Juanita, her mother, started searching. She went to the playground, called Debbie's name, checked every place her daughter could be. And when the hours dragged on, neighbors joined in searching the streets, shining flashlights into the dark corners of the neighborhood. Imagine that night, Debbie's family standing by the door, watching the hours tick by, waiting, hoping, feeling dread creep in. If you were there, where would you search? What would you think? 16 days later, Debbie's body was found in a wooded area just over a mile from her home. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. That discovery sent a shockwave through Marietta. This quiet town that trusted its neighbors now felt different, darker. The innocence of the place was gone. I remember that moment vividly. The silence, the weight in the air. Her family's faces as they looked at me, desperate for answers. No witnesses, no fingerprints, just a single tiny sample of DNA preserved from the scene. A sample that back then was almost useless. Imagine holding that DNA sample, knowing it could be the answer, but having no way to unlock it. What would you do? Would you keep that hope alive for the future? We worked day and night following every lead. We questioned neighbors, checked local offenders, and asked everyone who might have seen Debbie that night. But no one had. Each person we interviewed, each corner we searched, led us nowhere. The DNA we had was like a locked door with no key, a trace we couldn't decode. Every lead, every effort brought us back to the same place, a dead end. And with each passing day, the frustration grew. Each time I saw her mother, her eyes held that silent question. Is there hope? And I had no answer. If you were in my shoes, facing a wall of silence, Would you keep going? Would you be able to look her family in the eyes knowing you still didn't have the answer? Months turned to years and years to decades. Debbie's case went cold. It became just another unsolved file gathering dust as time went on. But her family never moved on. Every birthday, every anniversary, they left flowers at the spot where she was found. And I couldn't let it go either. I'd pull out her case file every so often, hoping I'd missed something. For 50 years, that memory stayed with me, a reminder of the promises I couldn't keep. But then in 2023, everything changed. After decades of silence, we finally had a chance to revisit the case with fresh eyes and new tools. Do you believe in second chances? Because this one was 50 years in the making. In 2023, the technology we'd been waiting for finally arrived. We still had that tiny DNA sample preserved carefully for all these years. This time, we had the tools to amplify it, to search for unique patterns and markers that were like a fingerprint embedded in the DNA. By finding these unique markers, we could trace connections first to distant relatives whose DNA was available in public records. With each match, we mapped out connections between relatives, building a family tree that pointed us in a single direction. And then we had it. William Rose. Rose had lived in Marietta at the time of Debbie's murder. He was a familiar face in the community, quiet, withdrawn. The DNA confirmed it. He was the one who had taken Debbie's life. He had died years before, but at last we had a name. Imagine being her family, hearing that name after all this time. A bittersweet relief. A victory that came too late, but finally answered the question that haunted them. The truth after 50 years of silence. But knowing who did this didn't answer everything. There was still that haunting question. Why? Why would William Rose target an innocent 9-year-old like Debbie? He had no criminal record, no history of violence. Nothing about him stood out. But as we looked closer, something began to emerge. Rose was a man on the edges of society, isolated, distant, with no close friends, no real connections. He was someone who kept to himself. People like Rose don't often show their darkness in obvious ways. Experts say that individuals who commit these kinds of acts often live in isolation, letting their desire for control and power build up over time, in secret. For people like Rose, their victims aren't seen as people. They become objects, something to control, something to use to feel powerful, even if only for a moment. Imagine that. A life so empty, so isolated that it twists into something dark. Rose didn't need a reason beyond his own loneliness and need for control. To him, hurting someone else, taking someone's innocence, was a way to feel powerful in a life where he otherwise felt invisible. And here's where I need you to look around your own world. People like Rose often live unnoticed, hiding their intentions behind a quiet exterior. Isolation, a need for power, a disregard for others. These traits can grow silently, unseen. If you notice someone struggling, someone disconnected, try to reach out. Sometimes a small connection can be enough to change someone's path. And if you ever sense darkness in yourself or in those around you, seek help. Because left unchecked, isolation and resentment can lead to places we never expect. When I finally got the answer, I thought of her family, of the 50 years they'd spent in the dark, of each moment they waited hoping to one day know the truth. But by the time we finally had that answer, Debbie's parents had both passed away. They'd never see justice for their daughter. Her mother and father went to their graves without knowing who had taken Debbie from them. But her brother Melvin was still here. When I told him the news, he sat quietly, processing years of grief and waiting. With a voice thick with emotion, he thanked us. He said,
I would like to say that I wish my mother was here, but I know she knows in heaven now that it's finally over.
For Melvin, there was finally some sense of peace, a small closure to a wound that had been open for decades. But it was a closure that came with pain, a resolution that felt both comforting and sorrowful. For 50 years, the truth had stayed hidden only to be revealed after those who had waited the longest were gone. Imagine living with that kind of pain, that unanswered question for a lifetime. And imagine the gratitude and sorrow in hearing that answer, knowing it came too late for so many. This case, Debbie's case, reminds us of why we keep searching, why justice, even delayed, still matters. Thank you for joining me in telling Debbie Lynn Randall's story, a story that finally, after 50 years, has an ending. And as Melvin said, it may have taken a lifetime, but for Debbie and for her family, it's finally over.